I got slides tonight. And I thought, before I get into my lesson, by way of review, I would go over my slides that I didn't have this morning. So, there they all are, in their glory. There's the points I was making. Yep. That's the Last Supper. That's the one I couldn't remember, and the name I couldn't. Anyways, okay. The road to Emmaus. One slide, that's all you get for tonight. The road to Emmaus. This was our theme for teen camp this year. And again, like I said this morning, Clint and Kara do a fantastic job with teen camp. We had 127 of our young people throughout the Northwest that were up at teen camp and a slew of adults helping out in various capacities. And last fall, Clint asked if I would want to do some of the speaking, and I said, sure, and he said, well, this is what we're thinking. We want to do lessons from the book of Luke and the interactions that Jesus has with different people throughout the book of Luke. And so we came up with this idea of the road to Emmaus. And so if you'll look in chapter 24 of Luke, we'll cover just where the genesis of this idea came from, and then we'll go into our lesson in chapter 7 is where we'll be at. But in chapter 24, at the end of the Gospel of Luke, we have this scene where two gentlemen are on their way to a village named Emmaus. Cleopas and one of his friends were walking along, and as they're walking, a stranger comes up beside them, and they start walking together, and they are lamenting the fact that Jesus has been crucified and He is no more. And so Jesus is there walking with them, and again, they don't know it's Jesus, but He's walking there with them, asking them questions and trying to understand what's going on. And they're talking about this Messiah that was supposedly to come, and now He's no more. And when you see in verse 21, it says, we had hoped that He was the one to redeem Israel. And so they themselves had this picture in mind of who Jesus was supposed to be, even though it was incorrect. And so they were discouraged that now this hope that had come to redeem Israel was no more. And so Jesus begins to reason with them from the Scriptures. And we see in verse 27, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, He interpreted to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning Himself. And it's not until they get to Emmaus and they sit down and they break bread together that their eyes are opened, and then they recognize that the person that had been traveling with them was Jesus Himself. And then in verse 31, it says, their eyes were opened and they recognized Him, and He vanished from their sight. In verse 32, they said to each other, did not our hearts burn within us while He talked to us on the road, while He opened to us the Scriptures? And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 apostles there and the disciples, and they told them everything that had happened with this stranger who turned out to be Jesus that was walking with them on the road to Emmaus. And then that very next scene, in verse 36, Jesus appears to them while Cleopas and his friend are sharing, hey, this is what happened. And Jesus appears to them then and begins to talk to them. And it's verse 44, He says this, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Now catch what happens in the very next verse. In verse 45, then He opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. Just like He did with Cleopas and his companion on the road to Emmaus, He walks through those Scriptures, talking with them and teaching them what His purpose truly was. And then when He appears before the disciples and the 11 apostles, He asks God, or He says, then He opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, to remind them of everything that He had already taught them. Everything that he had spoken to them as they lived together for 3.5 years, and now those things have come to fruition. And he's opening their minds so that they would understand the Scriptures. And then he says to them, "Thus it is written that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead, and that repentance for the forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in His name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem." But he opens their minds to understand the Scriptures. And I think to some degree we're on this journey on the road to Emmaus together, and we are learning and understanding who Jesus is and who He truly is for not just us as a body of believers, but to me as an individual. Now go all the way back to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, we see that Luke is writing this gospel account to an individual named Theophilus. And in verse 3 it says, "It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." That you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. It was important for Luke to write this orderly account for Theophilus so that he would understand that all the things that he had been taught about Jesus and who He was were true, and that he could trust in those and he could have certainty in those things. Now, when you consider that at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, Luke is writing so that Theophilus would have certainty. And I think that plays out to us as well, that we would have certainty in who Jesus is. And then it's bookended with the disciples having understanding, their eyes being opened so that they would have understanding of the Scriptures. When you see those bookends, it helps us to begin to understand the Gospel of Luke and why Luke is writing. And so he begins to write this gospel account and has all these different interactions with all these different people throughout the Gospel of Luke. And if you were just to read through Luke and mark down all the different people Jesus interacts with, it is a lot. It will fill up several sheets of paper. Okay? And so we begin to see as we go through Luke, or as you go through Luke, Jesus has these interactions not just with the rich people, or poor people, or people that are marginalized or on the outside, on the fringes of society, or the people that were accepted, or just His apostles or the Pharisees. He has these interactions with a whole host of people, and through each of those interactions, we get a glimpse of who Jesus is and what His purpose was. And that was to be the Messiah for all the world, and for everybody in the world, not just for a certain select few. And so that's where this theme came from, is this road to Emmaus, that we are on this journey and we are interacting with Jesus and we are learning who He is as our Savior and Messiah. And so when you get to Luke chapter 7 and verse 36, the title heading there is "A Sinful Woman Forgiven." When I was 4 or 5 years old, I'm the youngest of 4 boys. And you can only imagine, my parents, they commiserate with Travis and Libby. They understand. Power to the parents of 4 boys. But I was the youngest of 4 boys, and my parents, for some reason, had gone somewhere. I don't know if they went on a date or they went grocery shopping or something like that. But me and my 3 brothers were there at home alone. And we were watching TV, and our house had a basement. That's where the TV was. The living room was down in the basement for some reason. And so we were down there watching television, and it was like a circus show, or it was a magician that was on the TV. And he was taking a broomstick and taking plates and spinning them, right? Wow, why are you saying, "Oh no," already? You don't even know the story. Let me get through my story and then say, "Oh no." That was well deserved, because you're going to say it here in a second. So I saw that, and I thought I could do that. And so I went upstairs and grabbed a broom, and I grabbed a glass. It was a salad bowl or mixing bowl of some sort. It was large. And so I went back downstairs, and I'm watching, and I think, I can do this. And so I set that broom up, and I put that bowl on top, and I spin it. This is where you say, oh no. Now, I would like to say that I was a savant when it came to magic. And I spun that glass bowl like no other. But that's just not the case. Because when I went to spin it, it didn't even spin once. It just fell off and crashed. And it wasn't that it just broke into several large pieces. It was like 1,000,000 shards of glass all over the basement floor. And I knew right then that I was in trouble. And so my brothers, they're like, what are you doing? What were you thinking? They helped me get it cleaned up, and I went to my bedroom and put on every pair of underwear I owned. Yeah. Because I knew I was going to get a spanking when my parents got home. And as I was waiting for them to get home, and you know, like when something, you've done something wrong and mom and dad are coming and you know you're in trouble, that feeling you get in your stomach. Some of you are nodding because you know. Just that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach, and it just doesn't go away. And the longer you have to wait, that feeling gets bigger. You know what I mean? And so that's the feeling that I felt, and I want you to hold on to that feeling as we work through our text. We're going to interact with 3 different people here, a Pharisee and Jesus, and then this sinful woman. So in verse 36, one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. This was an invitation that Jesus was given by probably somebody in the community that was pretty prominent and pretty well known. And so Jesus readily accepts this invitation, and he goes to the Pharisee's house and he reclines at table. And that's a weird way to say that. And you have to understand that picture, because the way they're sitting at the table, it's a low table, and they're kind of sitting on their hip, leaned out to one side, and their feet are behind them. Without showing you what that would look like, that would be weird if I did. But that's Jesus' feet are out behind him as he's reclining at the table. And they begin to eat. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. Now we know nothing else about this woman. Other than the 2 descriptive phrases in this verse about her, we know that she is a sinner, and we know that she is a woman of the city. We don't know anything else about her. We don't know what her friend history is. We don't know what her family history is. We don't know what her work history is. We don't know where she lives. We don't know if she's rich or poor. We know nothing else other than that she's a woman of the city and she's a sinner. Most likely, she's probably a prostitute. And yet when she comes and sees Jesus, she finds out that Jesus is at the Pharisee's house. She comes and she brings an alabaster jar of ointment. And when she comes into the room, see what the text says. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now, my question is this: why is this woman here? Why is she at the house of the Pharisee who has invited only Jesus to come and have this meal? Typically, what would happen in this time frame, in this time period, is that people that were well known and very prominent, they usually had larger homes where they could host a meal like this. And so what they would do, they would invite guests that were traveling through, and they would invite them over for a meal. And then through that, they would have like an open door policy where people in the community could come and stand around that table and listen to the conversation that was being had. And so this Pharisee probably had a pretty large home, at least a home large enough where people in the community could come in and listen and see the meal that was being had. It could be a large open courtyard or something like that. But folks in the community could come and stand on the outside of that room or courtyard and listen and be a part of the meal. And so that's probably why this lady is there, this woman of the city, this sinner. She's probably there because this Pharisee has had an open door policy, because he wants everybody to see, like, hey, look, I have invited Jesus to my house, and you should come see him too. And so then from that, you can hear our conversation, and I get to look good in the community. I'm a prominent figure. And so this lady is there, but when she sees Jesus, she begins to weep and wet his feet with her tears and wipe her tears away and anoints his feet with that ointment from that alabaster flask that she has. Now when the Pharisee, verse 39, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself. He doesn't say this out loud. The text doesn't say he said, in his mind or anything like that. He said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. She is a sinner. And I don't know about you, when I read that part of the text, my mind automatically goes to the Disney movie, The Lion King. The original Lion King, made in 1994. That's the best one. And I hear Scar's voice. You know the voice I'm talking about? Scar has that voice that just drips with arrogance and smugness. That's what I hear when I see the Pharisee talking about this woman in such a way, like, if Jesus were a prophet, why would he even let her touch him? Does he not know who this woman is? And it's almost like he is speaking with a certain amount of disdain and malcontent for this woman because of who she is. He probably looks at her with a scowl on his face and is thinking to himself, why is she even here? She shouldn't be here in my home, but she's there. And then Jesus, as you go on in the text, Jesus answering said to him, Simon. This is the first time we hear Simon's name. We know the Pharisee's name is Simon. I have something to say to you. And he answers, say it, teacher. Like, hey, this is an open door policy. We're having a conversation. I want everybody in the community to see what we're talking about. So, yes, teacher, go ahead. Say what you have to say. And he says a certain money lender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. Now, we see that and we may think, oh, that's not a lot of money. But if you put it in perspective in today's wages, it actually is quite a bit of money. And so 500 denarii is worth about 20 months' wages. And so if you were to consider the average salary across the U.S., and I know in some parts it'll be way higher than this, and in some parts of the U.S. it'll be lower than this, but the average salary across the U.S. is $60,000 a year. And so for 2 years, that's $120,000. And so if it's 20 months, now you're down to $100,000. That's what 500 denarii is worth, $100,000. I don't know about you, but that's a lot of money. And so that's how much debt this man owed. The other one was 10% of that. He just owed 50 denarii, which would be $10,000. Either way, that's still a lot of money. And then we pick up in the text, when they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Now, catch what Simon says. He answers, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. You know, when you're posed with those questions that you're not quite sure if it's a trick question, and so you're like, I'm going to play this safe, I think that's what Simon's doing here. He's thinking, I know the obvious answer, but it could be a trick question here, and so he's trying to cover his bases. It's kind of like when my mom would come, and she's getting on to me or one of my brothers, and she would always say this, if everyone else jumped off a bridge, would you jump too? Well, I know the obvious answer is no, but there were times when I wanted to say, well, who's jumping? How high is the cliff? Because I might want to jump. But I never did because I knew my mom would send me to meet Jesus, right? And so, but that's the obvious answer. It's no, and the obvious answer here is, well, it's the one that has the larger debt. The one that has the larger debt is gonna be the one that's more grateful in this situation. And so, Jesus says to him, you have judged rightly. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? Do you see this woman? I entered your house, you gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Jesus is asking Simon, do you see this woman? And I'm sure Simon is thinking, duh, yes, Jesus, I see this woman. And if you knew who she was, you being the prophet that you are, you wouldn't let her touch your feet. And yet Jesus is saying, Simon, I see you and I also see this woman, but understand, Simon, she has seen me and she has recognized who I am. Because when I entered in and she came in, she has not stopped washing my feet. When I came in, she began to use her hair to wipe my feet and anoint my feet with the ointment that she had. Simon, you didn't even greet me with a kiss, which is a common thing in that day and age. We don't do that here in America, but most of the rest of the world, they greet one another with a kiss on the cheek, kissing the side to either side. We don't do that because we think that's weird, but that's a common practice in the rest of the world. And Jesus is telling Simon, you didn't even greet me when I came in. And yet she has not stopped kissing my feet. The woman recognized who Jesus was as the Messiah and the Savior. And she anointed Jesus' feet, which is interesting because to anoint one's head is a sign of respect. And it's a sign that says, I respect you and you are a person of prominence. And Jesus is telling Simon, you didn't even do that for me. And yet we have Jesus, who is the Messiah, the anointed one. And so she has recognized who Jesus is. And so that's why Jesus asks, do you see this woman? Because Jesus does. And he says, therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but he who is forgiven little, loves little. In that scene and in that moment, what this woman has done for Jesus, she has given him the utmost respect out of everything that she had at that moment, which was her tears and her hair and an alabaster flask of ointment. And yet Simon, who is a very prominent figure, most likely in his community, gave him nothing. Didn't recognize who Jesus was. He just thought he was some prophet. And he didn't recognize that Jesus was the Messiah. And so he gave Jesus nothing. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Which that astounded everybody sitting at the table, because they are sitting at the table and they're saying, who is this who even forgives sins? Well, it's Jesus, because that's the only person that can forgive sins. No one else can do that. Only Jesus can. And that's why he's the one that steps forward and he's looking at this woman and he forgives her sins. Now, here's a question I want to ask. Why is she crying? Why is she crying? Why is she weeping and her tears are just falling all over his feet? I wonder if the reason why she's crying is because when she walked into Simon's house that day, Simon and his companions looked at her with contempt and probably had a scowl on, they had scowls on their faces, and they were asking themselves, why is this woman here? She doesn't belong here. She's a sinner. She's a woman of the city. And yet when Jesus looks at her, and maybe she comes in and she has eye contact with Jesus, she doesn't feel that arrogant, smug, drippy look that Simon is giving her, but instead it's a look of warmth and compassion and acceptance. Now, Jesus knows what Simon is thinking when he says, if Jesus only knew who this was, he wouldn't allow this to happen. And the text seems to let us, or implies that Jesus knows what he's thinking. He also knows Simon's name. Perhaps he knew this woman's name. And there's a conversation that isn't recorded for us, but maybe it was a conversation that said, I see you and I accept you for who you are. And I want to do so much more with you if you're willing. And I think that's why the woman can't help but just to weep at Jesus' feet, because she sees a look of acceptance in his eyes that she did not see in Simon's eyes. That night when my parents got home, I went upstairs. I knew they were home. I heard the doors close. And I was crying. I was in tears, probably because I knew I was going to get a spanking. Right? And I told them what had happened. And I was expecting the worst. But what happened is that my mom picked me up, and my mom and my dad, they stood there and they hugged me. And they said it was going to be okay. And that it was all right. You see, in that moment, what my parents did, they gave me what I needed, not what I deserved. And I think in this moment with the sinful woman, Jesus gives the sinful woman what she needed, not what she deserved. And the powerful part in this, at least for me, is that the woman had the courage to go into a place where she knew she wasn't accepted to see Jesus. And she does that, and not only that, Jesus sees her and gives her what she needed. And that would be a question that I would have for you. Do you know that Jesus sees you? And if so, do you have the courage to approach him and receive what you need, not what you deserve? If there is anything that we can do for you tonight, if you need to put on Christ in baptism, or you just need prayers of the congregation and encouragement, would you come as we stand and sing?
Oh, listen to